Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our conference. My name is Karolien. I work for Statistics Flanders, and I'm your host for this morning. My colleagues and me are very happy that many people have registered for the conference of today on regional statistics. Regional statistics are becoming increasingly important for a wide range of users. International statistical institutions such as OECD, Eurostat, and the UN need regional statistics to complement the national picture. On the other hand, regional statistical institutes are facing a number of challenges in developing high-quality official statistics. So we hope we can offer you a very interesting day on this topic. But before we start, I'd like to go over a few practical things with you. First of all, the Wi-Fi code and Twitter hashtag are shown on the screen and can also be found at the back of the program book you received. Secondly, you see there are cameras all over the place. They are filming the presentations and the speakers, and that's for the online participants. So also a very big welcome for those behind their computers. May I ask the people who are following at home to mute their microphones? And then thirdly, I want to tell that all parts of the conference will be recorded and that this recording will be published on our YouTube channel. So I think we're now ready for the real start of our conference. And that's why I tell you a bit more about the program. First of all, we have an introduction by Roeland Beerten, Chief Statistician of Statistics Flanders, so the organization that has set up this conference. In the morning session, we have two keynote presentations. In this presentation, the importance of regional statistics to complement the national picture will be pointed out. In addition, it is time to look back at the achievements and the challenges of the Belgium Interfederal Institute of Statistics, as it almost celebrates its 6th anniversary. In the afternoon, there are two parallel sessions which will look more closely at the number of challenges regional statistical authorities are facing. And at the end of the day, we are happy to invite you to a network reception. So to start the day, I will now give the floor to Roeland Beerten, Chief Statistician of Statistics Flanders and Head of Flanders Statistics Authority.
Okay, thank you, Karolien. And also from me, welcome to this one-day international conference. I'm really glad we got out of the corona epidemic and we can see each other again face to face. It's an amazing experience again, I think. So welcome from me. I'm going to give a short introduction to today's conference, maybe tell you a bit more about the reason why we wanted to talk about regional statistics today. And of course, the first thing as statisticians that we do is we look at definitions. It's very important for statisticians to know what we're talking about. So I thought let me start with like an overview of what we mean by regions. So if I go to the international arena, if you go to UN meetings or meetings at the international level, very often we speak about statistical regions in terms of world regions. So at the UN, when you talk about regional statistics, quite often they're talking about statistics from Africa or from South America, North America. So that's one way of looking at regions in a statistical sense, but that's not going to be the focus of today. So I'm just saying that there is a use of the term regional statistics, which is used internationally, but that's not really the focus of today. What we do want to focus on today is what we show here on the map of Europe. And that's the regions which are actually distinguished between countries or between member states, in this case, of the European Union. And so I think it's important to recognize that there is regional diversity at this level in terms of statistics. Not just in the way the statistics are being used and being published, but also, of course, in the statistics themselves. And we quite often see quite big regional differences. This map is showing, I think it's GDP per capita. So yeah, it's quite a useful way of looking at variation within the statistics itself, is by region. And so, of course, like for Europe, we all know that, or we should know, that Eurostat uses what we call the NUTS classification, NUTS. So at the lower level, there you have the countries, the member states, but then at the NUTS 1 level, you actually have the regions. And those regions within Europe are then being distinguished further at further levels of detail at NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 level. So that's what we are interested in today. Is mainly, I think, this NUTS 1 level. And of course, you can look at regional statistics at this level for the whole of Europe. But of course, because we are in Belgium, we are going to look at Belgium in a bit more detail. So in Belgium, we have 3 NUTS 1 regions, namely the Flemish region in the north, Flanders. Then we have the Walloon region, Wallonia in the south. And then we have a special status for Brussels, which is the capital. But Brussels is like a separate region within the Belgian context. Now, if you look at statistics within those regions, I think it's quite clear that the reason why statistics are being produced at the regional level is because there's a close link to the policy. And if you think about statistics, when they're being developed, there is always a close link with policy questions. And what does policy need to know in terms of the numbers in order to develop good policy? And of course, like in many countries in Europe, but also worldwide, but let's keep the focus on Europe today, this is kind of institutionalized. And so we do have like regional statistical institutes that actually produce official statistics at the regional level. So that's more or less the focus of today, I think, that we really look at the production, dissemination of statistics at this regional level within a country, because it's closely linked to the policy development within regions, which is quite often devolved in terms of policy responsibility from the national level to the regional level. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, I think the other big issue that we face in terms of regional statistical organizations is that we are looking at very different systems in terms of the statistical system within the regions. And so this slide gives you a kind of typology, if you want, in terms of the decentralization within the government administrations within those regions. And so typically we have at the national level, for instance, we have like on the left-hand side what we call a centralized system, where you have like the National Statistical Institute and the central bank, but that's where it stops. So those are the only actors in terms of production of official statistics in a centralized model. If you then shift to the other side, to the right-hand side, you actually see a different model where you still have an NSI at the national level, but you also have different other national authorities, which actually are responsible for official statistics on various themes. So for instance, you could have the Department for Education, the Department for Transport, and so on. And they all produce official statistics closely linked to the policy for those specific topic areas. So I think that's one of the challenges I think that we face in a national context, but also quite often in a regional context where we have to deal with like a decentralized setup within the government administration that also needs coordinating and that needs some common coordination. So in a way, we are looking at this horizontal coordination within the regions when you have a decentralized system. But of course, we then also have to coordinate with the institutions at the federal level and sometimes at the local level as well in terms of communities and provinces. So in a way, we are looking at a fairly complicated effort in terms of coordination that gets together in this picture, where you look at the coordination of the system within the government administration, but also the coordination of the system within the national context to liaise and to coordinate with federal national level institutions and actors. So I think that's quite an interesting question. The challenges that come from this setup. How do these regional institutions, how do they relate to the federal level institutions? What are the types of relationships that exist there? But also, how can we actually get better at the coordination within the government administrations to coordinate those decentralized systems of statistics within the government administration at the regional level? And so as Karolien said, so this will be one of the topics for today, I think. We've got like one session on working together this afternoon. The other session we have this afternoon is, of course, on international cooperation. And this is why we are actually also looking at a session this afternoon, looking at how we can actually cooperate as regional statistical authorities in relation to international institutions. And so, of course, we've got organizations like Eurostat and the OECD who have a very keen interest in regional statistics. Of course, quite often in the recognition that the policy development in certain topic areas also sits at the regional level rather than at the national level. So I think it's a very interesting second question for today is like, how do we relate as national institutions, but also as regional institutions to those international organizations when it comes to regional statistics? So that's what I wanted to say as introduction for today. We've got a very interesting speaker next from the OECD, Paul Schreyer, but I'll hand over to Karolien for now to introduce him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roeland. Indeed, it's now time to introduce our first keynote speaker, Paul Schreyer. He's a Chief Statistician of the OECD and Director of the Statistics and Data Directorate since 2020. He joined the organization in 1988 and held various positions in the different directorates. Before joining OECD, he was a research fellow at the IFO Institute for Economic Research in Munich and an assistant professor at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Paul Schreyer holds a PhD in economics. His personal research areas include national accounts, measurements of capital, productivity, welfare, non-market activity, and prices. He's the author of several OECD manuals and has a record of publications in international journals and books. His presentation is titled More Granular, More Timely, The New Statistical Landscape. Mr. Schreyer, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks and good morning. It's a real pleasure being here, being back to Brussels again, being for the first time in Statistics Flanders and being in this colorful room that already sets the scene very well. You just heard a little bit about myself, and I think it immediately became clear I'm not a specialist in regional statistics, but I've been getting quite interested in the overall developments that have been happening in the world of statistics, in the sense that we are increasingly looking at more timely, more granular data. And of course, that includes granularity in a spatial sense and in a regional sense as well. So what I'd like to do this morning is to give you a little bit of an overview about, oops. I don't think. It's not. It's a PDF. Here we are on this one. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Having worked out the IT here, what I'm going to do is I'll start with a few general remarks on the landscape and the developments that we are observing here. Many of you who work in the statistics field will be well acquainted for that. I do hope it will still be useful in bringing some of these things together. I will then go on and do a bit of self-promotion in the sense that I will bring in a number of OECD examples that we've been doing in this new landscape, and then follow on with a few ingredients that I think are really important to harness the power of new data and new tool that we dispose of. And I will conclude with a few basic indications. So let's set the scene a bit. Not only since the pandemic and the current crisis has there been an increasing demand for timely and granular statistics. Everyone who is in the area has experienced this. The policy side, citizens want more detailed information. They want to recognize themselves locally in their street. Indicators that present national averages are very often not good enough anymore. We saw, of course, during the pandemic that very different groups in the population are differently affected. So women were differently affected from men, low-income households differently from high-income households. Regions between them were affected differently, small firms from large firms. So this power of granular information is something that has really come through the pandemic, but it was there before. So we saw an acceleration of this demand here. Now, of course, with these new challenges, with these new requests come a need for new guidance, new definitions, new data, and new tools that need exploring. We, on a more structural basis, we have, of course, seen new sources and tools emerging through the digital transformation. It's also well known that the national statistical offices have no more a monopoly in terms of providing data to the public, as used to be the case. There is now a very competitive landscape out there. The role of NSOs is changing and has been changing as well. Partially because they are not only producers of data anymore, they're also themselves increasingly users of some of these sources that have become available out there. The overall data ecosystem that exists is such that data is often fragmented, it doesn't communicate between sources, it's idiosyncratic, and not always accessible for users. So there's a lot, we know there's a lot of data out there, but not everything is fit for use. And this is really also where a new role of statistical offices come in. I have abbreviated those with NSOs, but of course that just as much applies to RSOs if you want. One thing that we are observing, certainly among the OECD countries, is these emerging data stewardship roles that statistical offices increasingly embrace. What is meant by data stewardship? Well, actually, it's a somewhat blurry definition, but essentially it is about bringing some sort of governance to this data ecosystem that exists out there. It's about sharing and collaboratively improving data, making it interoperable, and streamlining production processes. You have here a statement from Statistics Canada that is one of the countries that has actively embraced this new role. There are others, of course. There's no single model, as I said, of data stewardship, but typically it involves that the statistical office provides guidance to other producers of official statistics like central banks, statistical operations in ministries in terms of standards, guidance, making sure that the data that's being collected talks to each other is usable. In terms of administrative data and statistics producer, the data steward role consists in interacting on these administrative data collection best ex ante, so to say, in advance, so that data is already collected in a way that it is afterwards also useful for statistical purposes. And then, of course, there are the third parties and private data where these data stewards can also play a role in promoting standards, in terminology, classifications, labeling, and so forth. Some countries have put in place what they call a once-only principle in data collection, where the statistics office or the government, if you want, says we only approach citizens once for a particular piece of data. That is, for example, the case in Switzerland, and Austria as well is being talked about. The idea is, of course, to reduce the burden, but you can imagine it also involves a lot of interaction afterwards between different government institutions to actually share that data if it's only to be collected once. But all this falls under this broad heading of data stewardship, which takes different forms and shapes in different countries. Data stewardship also implies that the statistics function takes on new forms, not only institutionally, but also in terms of contents. Here is an example from the UK. The ONS conducted what was called an infection survey during the pandemic because it wasn't actually clear. You needed the statistical infrastructure to make sure that you could get representative samples of the UK population that could be tested so that you could actually make a statement about the pandemic. In many other countries, all you got was information about positive tests, but whether or not that was representative for the population as a whole wasn't clear. So here's a new role that was adopted by the ONS and by a number of other institutions in other countries as well, which a number of years ago probably wouldn't have been as clearly defined. Again, it's about timeliness. These surveys took place at a very high frequency, spatially disaggregated. And of course, you need a certain level of trust also in the institution so that people are ready to share health information, as it were, here with the ONS. Another example is Switzerland. In terms of a new service that has been put in place, it's called the Data Science Competence Center, where by the Federal Statistical Office provides services to users of microdata that are hosted by the Federal Statistical Office. The services consist of the development of quality standards, guidelines on data protection, but also interaction and advice on data science methods that researchers, users of these data may be using, advice in terms of a methodology, execution of data science requests. So if you have a remote access to the microdata, and even training. So it's a whole new package of services that is being provided in this role that the Swiss Statistical Office sees itself. I'm just quoting those two by way of example. As I said, there are others, but it all tells you something about how the institutions are evolving in this new landscape. Now, let me move closer to home, so to say, to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the OECD is doing, and more specifically on spatial granularity, because this lines up nicely with our overall topic of regional statistics. 5 examples that I've lined up. They are not exhaustive, but I think they are somewhat representative for the work that is being done. They are also representative for the different approaches that come through typically in harnessing these new data sources. Example number 1 is a house price tracker, which has 2 parts to it. The first step was really simply collecting and documenting official data from countries at the subnational level on the development of house prices. House prices, and if you get these data from official statistics, they tend to be of good quality, so they're quality adjusted, they are stratified, and we brought them together as part of a bigger project on housing. So this is sort of the official statistic that come in here. But now what happens is you also have data in countries, typically non-official data, like from notaries or banks, that also paint a picture of house prices at the regional level. And very often they're not consistent with the official data, and not consistent in the sense of time series versus level comparisons. So we looked at Spain in the first instance, where INE, the Spanish statistical office, produces house price data in terms of rates of change over time. And then we were able to tap into a source that is provided by the Spanish notaries, which provide information on the levels, so actually transactions and the house price levels. And if you look at the evolution of levels, well, it doesn't match at all the evolutions that INE has shown. So what we did then in the second part of this project was to set up a model that would allow to make those 2 sources as consistent as possible by sort of maximizing the information that we could draw from each of those sources, recognizing the differences, but painting an overall consistent picture of house price levels and developments at the subnational level. So this is going forward, and other countries have now joined in on the effort. Second example is one where, again, where private sector data is used almost to supplant the official data that we have. What happens if you look at what we call the traditionally collected or based on self-reporting information about internet access and reliability, is not of great quality. You don't get very good responses and a very good picture at what is happening at the spatial level. So we went into a partnership with Ookla, which is a site that tests the speed of your computer. So they got a lot of observations, of course, on the requests for speed tests for computers. And again, if you look at this data, you get a much more granular and timely picture of the disparities in internet speeds that exist within countries who are using where these services are being used. The problem is, of course, that again, you don't know here about exactly about the representativity of the data that you get, but it certainly you can stratify it up to a point, because there's some information on the users. But it is again something where the official data can be combined or complemented with the newly discovered sources. Third example is a pandemic-related example where my colleagues have combined data from death registers, and of course there you have a very detailed local information as well from statistical offices or health ministries, depending on the country, to compute excess mortality rates at a local level, and use those in the discussion and in the analysis. And then, of course, you can combine this with other indicators that are also spatially linked or that are spatially indicated, and try and find out some correlations, causalities, or tell a story about excess mortality where it has happened. Here's an example of something that hasn't worked out, which is always useful to bring in as well, I think. The idea was to strike a partnership with TripAdvisor and get some combination of official data and web scraped data to assess the impact of COVID-19 on tourism in regions and cities at a high level of granularity. The problem was that, I mean, my colleagues engaged and they started the web scraping, but then the legal constraints. Our legal department said, well, we are not sure that you are actually allowed to web scrape in a big way from one company. So there's a bit of a uncertainty about the legal issues here. So this has been suspended for the time being until there is clarity about the right to web scrape from one particular site, and which is something that leads to a more general observation, namely that yes, we have a lot of new tools, we have a lot of new data, but very often the impediments to exploiting them are also of an institutional or legal nature, not only of a technical or access nature. The fifth example is again one where new data sources are combined with existing traditional data that is a measure of the exposure of the population to air pollution. The combination of sources is one whereby geospatial data that allows you to measure or to get an indication of air quality by detailed grid, combined with census data that informs you about population density. And those two measures combined give you an indication of the exposure of the population to air pollution. The nice thing, of course, is that in difference to land-based air quality observations, is something that is right away available at very detailed granularity, and for the world at large. So it's a beautiful source that then can also be compared with, of course, other sources, and generate some discussion on this. So here's just a little map that shows the results here. Those were 5 examples for things that my colleagues or we have been doing at the OECD. As I said, there are others, and in a way they can be generalized because they can be done at the national level, they can be done at the regional level, they can be done at the international level as well. What I'd like to do next is talk about 3 ingredients that I see important to make the use of these new sources operable and successful. I don't think it's an exhaustive list, but those three I think are at least necessary ingredients. They may not be sufficient, they may not be complete, but those three are important. First one is harmonization. Harmonization in a statistical sense. We do have, of course, a lot of regional data at the OECD as well. Typically, the regional data follows the administrative definitions of the regions because that's what we get from countries. And that makes a lot of sense because policies are also formulated, regional policies at a regional level. So you want some coherence in terms of the observations if you want to analyze policies afterwards. And we have a whole regional database with a lot of indicators that basically replicate observations at the territorial level, but following more administrative definitions. But of course, you also want to make comparisons across countries on, say, developments in cities, in urban areas, in rural areas. And then you run into the problem of international comparability when you have very different definitions or very different sizes of what constitutes, say, Paris compared to Rome follows a very different administrative logic, and the comparison is not obvious. So this is where harmonization comes in. And for a number of years, the European Commission worked with the OECD to derive a consistent definition about what constitutes urban area, what constitutes a city, what constitutes a rural area. Essentially, it's based on geographical grids that are overlaid again with population density figures, and that then defines what is an urban area and what is a rural area. There's also some classification and terminology that comes across. And this is really important and complements in a nice way the information that we have on the administrative side. There are other examples of harmonization. Of course, in terms of classification, in terms of data gathering, I only brought one of those to your attention. The second ingredient is guidance, in the sense that statistical offices that operate as stewards, as data stewards, need to provide guidance to navigate in this new landscape. And of course, guidance relates in particular to quality and privacy of or maintenance of privacy in data management. When we talk about quality, and typically when you talk about quality as well, we not only mean accuracy of data, we also mean timeliness, we mean accessibility, we mean reproducibility, we mean security of data. So all the attributes that together constitute quality data, and which we mean and which we have to apply to these new sources when we use them. So here's a little graph. I'm not going to go into any great detail. It's our own data quality framework that we try to apply to these new sources when they are being used in an OECD context. I've just encircled here the new sources, and they range from commercial microdata to crowdsourced web survey data. The message here is that these sources are extremely heterogeneous. Okay, they're very different in terms of how you get them, in terms of the legal implications, the IT around it, and so on. But still, they are different news sources, and you have a life cycle of the data that goes from design to the overall evaluation. And the quality criteria range, as I said, from the intrinsic data quality, so that's essentially the accuracy of data, to security and reproducibility. And those two last elements we have actually added over our traditional data quality framework, because in the past, we didn't have to worry too much about reproducibility or security. Those two things were not a great issue at the OECD. Now we have to make sure we comply with security protocols at the OECD. We have to make sure that when colleagues use new sources of data, that the usage of these sources is traceable and reproducible, so that when there's a change in staff or someone leaves, or the results can be reproduced and traced back. And this is a whole new effort of ensuring quality in operations. And it's a lot of work implementing this and providing guidance, so to say, behind those elements. The third ingredient that I wanted to mention is a very general one, but again, one that has gained massively importance in the new data ecosystem, and it's about co-investment. Many institutions face the same challenges, and none of our statistical institutions are awash with funds. So there's a lot to be said for sharing the cost and co-investing in tools and capabilities that are fairly similar very often across countries. Here's our own laboratory for geospatial analysis. That's just a platform that my colleagues have set up at the OECD to promote transparency, reproducibility of open data pipelines, and promoting responsible use of geospatial data. It cuts across institutions and scientific programs. So this is basically a platform that has been set up, and it allows sort of conversations about integration of geospatial information, statistical data, and spatial modeling. That's a sort of co-investment, but of course, more explicit co-investment, especially at the international level, come through, for example, in what is called the HLG-MOS. This is a complicated abbreviation for high-level group for the modernization of official statistics. It's something that is run under the Conference of European Statisticians, so that's the UN ECE. And it is basically a group of committed statisticians that got together several years ago and said, we want to co-invest in modernizing our organizations. And you have the list of countries here before you. So Eurostat and the OECD are also very active in this. It's about processes, so supporting standards that are then applied across organizations. It's about exchanging on capabilities and communications. It's about innovation. There's a blue sky thinking network about how can our institutions develop faster. How do we deal with confidentiality? Say, for example, there's some guidance on synthetic data sets. There's a group on machine learning. And all this is basically a way of co-investing, and the different institutions put in some funds to make this happen. And it's been quite a nimble and successful operation, I should say. Another example is something that is led by us, by the OECD. It's the Statistical Information System Collaboration Community. You have the partners here listed before you. Here, the objective is the development and maintenance of a data management tool. It's called .stat, in a modular and adaptable basis. Again, I think this is a piece of work that has been expanding going forward over the years, and the partners put in money into the operations, and everyone benefits from the product that is being developed there jointly. So this idea of co-investment is powerful, I think, and fundamental in this new landscape where resources are scarce and problems are very often similar across countries or maybe also across regions. Final example here of co-investment is something that is happening between several international organizations, in particular World Bank, IMF, OECD, and the Inter-American Development Bank. The idea here is to connect with large digital players, and you have these firms here, so from LinkedIn, Google, and so on, with a view to being able to exploit the data that they hold for research and analytical purposes. The firms are interested in this because they don't get 500 requests from the different organizations, but it's all channeled through one activity. There's a framework being negotiated for access, and in terms of license agreements, and so the institutional and legal setting has been worked out. And the different institutions here, we co-invest. We put in funds because we need resources to make it happen. And it's been working quite well and hopefully can be expanded in the future. So in conclusion, we are in a world of data ecosystem that provide a whole set of new possibilities for evidence, for policy, for analysis. At the same time, I mean, this ubiquity of data also means that people look for trusted information, and this is where this role of the state data stewardship comes in as one example. Because statistical offices can help to generate that trust by providing guidance, by labeling, by helping to navigate through the information system. The demand for timely and granular data, I've mentioned that throughout my little presentation here, but probably the spatial disaggregation is the single most important element of disaggregation that is being asked for. And you have many facets, of course, of breaking things down, but by region, by place is the thing that speaks most to people out there, to civil society, but also to policymakers. And I do think that NSOs, official statistics, and international organizations have an important role to play there. And there's a lot of exciting work coming ahead of us. So thank you for that.
Are there any questions? Not at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious about the legal problems you encounter with the web scraping exercise. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, I was surprised about that because at the end of the world, what happened there is that you look at a public source, and then you work with that. So, and it's not personal data. So, what kind of legal problems, I mean, in general?
The issues that arise are mainly of the sort that the holder of the owner of the website are unhappy when there's a lot of crawling that happens, because it can slow down the operations of the website, and apparently there is a bit of I mean, so they could complain about this, and there is a bit of a discussion also about the ownership of the information that is on it, even though it's publicly available, but it's actually available for a different purpose, you see. So it is not too difficult to imagine from a legal perspective that things are not well defined yet. Normally, what we try to do is actually to actively approach the owner of the website and say, are you happy for the OECD or anyone to exploit these data? Sometimes that works, or sometimes it even works in the sense that the owner of the website provides data in a more easily accessible way for us than just in crawling, because they want to avoid the slowing down of the websites. But it's not something that is a matter of course, let's put it this way.
Thank you.
Good morning. Just a question. You were talking about many new data sources who are around and which we can use to make or to produce official statistics. But what about the impact of dependency? Because now you're going to be very dependent upon all those different players. I mean, if you have your own organization and you have your own data collection, you are responsible for that. And if you want to change something, you change something, and we're responsible for that. You have that ownership. But if you're going to the whole world with the data ecosystem, you are creating a lot of dependencies. So how can you deal with that? Have you some tricks and tips about that to deal with that?
Well, that's a very good point, and it should actually be very clear that I'm not suggesting that we necessarily take new sources instead of the existing sources, but really in a way of combining them, complementing them, drilling down further, either spatially or otherwise. So that should be very clear. It's to complement, not to supplant the existing data, even because some of the new sources also need very basic official information like census data. I mean, you will always need this and compile it one way or the other. Now, in terms of your specific question, absolutely, it is important that, for example, sources are durable in a way that they don't, fall off the cliff a month after you've started using them. So there is no silver bullet for that, but of course you want to look into the type of source that you are engaging with. I mean, is it what type of company is this? What type of history has it? Sometimes it is possible to enter into a direct relationship also and strike agreements, and then there's a certain obligation certainly on both sides to go forward, and so it depends a lot on the source as well. Sometimes it can be an issue with little risk. Sometimes it can be an issue with a lot of risk. I mean, for example, geospatial data, I don't think there's a risk of the source falling off. It's sort of half public, it's completely public. We can be pretty sure that this will exist for a long time in a very accessible way, even though you don't control the generation of those data. When it comes to using the data that specific companies hold for your statistics, the risk becomes greater. Of course, sometimes it's only a matter of using these data for individual projects rather than on an ongoing basis. You see, the data development partnership that I mentioned is very much tuned to that sort of investigation. You know, you get a request to carry out a study, and you see that, I don't know, the data that LinkedIn has on labor markets can be useful for that. So you tap into it, you conduct it instead of making a survey, say, and you can produce a very nice analysis. The dependency is reduced because it's not something that enters in your quarterly publication, and you really need to depend on it.
Thank you very much, Paul. A very good talk. You talked about the role about data stewards and the quality, accuracy and timeliness of the data. I just wondered, where do you see good practice in this area happening, and what do you think makes that person in that role successful?
Well, good practice is emerging in a number of places. I mean, I showed example of Canada. This is a good place to look at. I also quoted Switzerland. Probably there's a little bias there because I'm part of the Federal Commission on Statistics in Switzerland, but a bias in the sense that I have a good view of what is happening. But it's a great example, I think, in terms of the activities that are being taken to make this data stewardship happen. I mean, Switzerland is, as many of you will know, is a federal country, okay, in a big way. So you have statistical operations at various levels, and the amount of effort that needed to go into harmonizing, getting everyone on board institutionally is something that was really remarkable in Switzerland. It's probably something that is true for Belgium as well. And it's an effort that is easily overlooked because you think, well, the institutions are there. No, yes, they're there, but you need to, the head of the Swiss Statistical Office went personally to see all the statistical offices in the cantons, talked to them, explained his vision, got them round, because there's also a lot of investment that has to be made in the subnational entities to actually be able to be part of this broader system of data stewardship. So that's why I brought those two in. New Zealand is another country where the government has given an explicit role to the New Zealand statistician to be the country's data governor, and the institution to be the data steward of New Zealand. Again, you will find different features there, but it's all very interesting and interesting practices that are worth being exchanged and looked at.
So no more questions, then it's time for a second keynote speaker. I will now announce Roeland Beerten properly. It was very short, but now I'm going to do it right. So as I told you, Roeland Beerten is Chief Statistician for the Government of Flanders and head of the Flanders Statistics Authority. So he's responsible for implementing official statistics policy as sets out in Flemish and international legislation, with the aim of producing and disseminating independent, high-quality official statistics. Before taking up this post, Roeland worked in the United Kingdom for more than 20 years. First at the Office of National Statistics, where he led a number of survey and census programs, and then at the Royal Statistical Society, where he was a director responsible for policy development for official statistics, statistical education, and public relations. He studied sociology and social research methods at the KU Leuven and KU Brussels, and management and leadership development at the Ashridge Hult Business School. Mr. Beerten will give a speech on the Interfederal Institute of Statistics. The institute has now been in existence for 6 years, so it's a good moment to look back. Mr. Beerten.
Okay, thanks, Karolien. Yeah, just had to take some water there. I was thinking maybe I should have brought cake and champagne as well for 6 years of the ISS, but I didn't do that. So what I'll do today is I'll just give you an overview of what we do in Belgium to operate and to coordinate a rather complex system of official statistics. And I'm going to do that by talking about the IIS. Just take my notes here. So the first thing I'm going to show you again is, of course, the map of Belgium. That's where we start. You've seen this picture before in my first talk. So as I said before, we have 3 regions in Belgium: the Flanders region, Wallonia region, and Brussels as a separate region. In the Belgian institutional context, we also have a concept of communities, which is a separate administrative concept, but I'm not going to go into that too much because we're not here at a conference on institutional or constitutional law, so I'm going to skip over that. So I'll mainly talk about the regions today. And of course, within Belgium, for a number of years now, we have been looking at a regional decentralization of the official statistics function. And so the 3 regions on this map, they do have their own statistics institution. And so these are the 3 on this slide. So for Flanders, we have the Flanders Statistics Authority, which was established by law as the institution within Flanders government that looks after official statistics. But we also have something called Statistics Flanders. And actually, Statistics Flanders is the name of the network of official statistics producers within Flanders. So we do work with this decentralized setup in Flanders. And this decentralized network, we've given the name Statistics Flanders. So that's the institute in Flanders. In Wallonia, we have EWEBs. That's the colleagues in Wallonia. They take on the official statistics function in Wallonia. And then in Brussels, we have BISA, the Brussels institution for the Brussels region. And in Brussels, they take on the role of the statistics authority within Brussels when it comes to official statistics. So the thing to note is that these 3 organizations are actually fairly new. They've only been there for about 5 years, I think, each of them. Well, not the EWEBs and BISA, because they basically existed before. So basically, those 2 existing institutions were given the role of statistical authority. In Flanders, we did it slightly differently. In Flanders, we basically said we are going to create a new statistics authority. It has taken on staff from a previous institute or a previous team, which did more this kind of study work for the Flemish government. But the function itself is a brand new function. And I think if you look at what we've achieved, it's actually quite remarkable, because in the 3 regions, it's the first time in many years that we introduced the whole concept of official statistics. So before these 3 authorities existed, the governments and the administrations were producing statistics, but they were never actually captured by the framework and the institutional obligations that you typically find in countries around official statistics. So this is quite a feat, actually, that we managed to set up an official statistics function within those governments and administrations. But of course, in Belgium, we still have, at the federal level, at the national level, we have still a number of important players as well. And I've just listed them on this slide. So first of all, we have StatBel, which is of course the NSI for Belgium, the National Statistical Institute. Has been there for many years, not under this name. Before it was called something else, the NIS in Dutch. But for a long time, they were the only official statistics function within Belgium in relation to, for instance, Eurostat. And so they've been around for a long time, and they still produce quite a lot of the official statistics for Belgium. The second player here is the kind of Department for Economy at the federal level, within the federal government. It's the actual mother department for StatBel. So they actually have an interest in economic statistics because of their policy brief. But StatBel is like one of the directorates within the FOD economy. So they are sitting at the table as well. And then within Belgium, we have two other institutions which play an important role in terms of national accounts and economic statistics, which of course are the National Bank of Belgium. They have quite a big statistics division there, producing financial statistics and economic statistics on Belgium. And we have the Federal Planning Bureau, which traditionally in Belgium has also worked on things like the budgetary statistics and national accounts as well. So at the federal level, there's all these institutions, all these organizations that actually are also part of the system of official statistics in Belgium. So you do get a quite complicated picture, of course. And so that's why when this concept of regional statistical authorities in Belgium was established, it was also established that we need coordination. It would be really silly if we all would go away and just do our own thing without talking to each other. So I'll talk a bit about it in a minute, a bit more, but basically in 2014, the legislation prescribed that, okay, we will have the regional statistical authorities, but it's also very imperative that we work together and that we coordinate, and that's going to happen under the form of the Interfederal Institute for Statistics. So what is that Interfederal Institute for Statistics? So it all started with a legal framework, with a cooperation agreement between the federal government and the regional governments in Belgium. That set out that actually the formal competence for official statistics in Belgium would be what they call interfederalized. So interfederalizing means that it's not completely devolved, but it's going to be a shared responsibility between the regions and the national level. So the cooperation agreement does specify that StatBel continues to have the role of the NSI in Belgium, but it also specifies that the regional statistical authorities have an equivalent status. So we are not sitting under StatBel, we have the same legal status as StatBel as a statistical authority within the regions. It also then specified that in Belgium we have a bit of an interesting situation whereby the national accounts in Belgium, they're not being produced by StatBel, but by a separate organization, the Institute for National Accounts. And so for this institute, it also specified that the chief statisticians of the regional authorities would have a seat at the table of the boards of the Institute for National Accounts, of course, to look at the regional dimensions in economic statistics and national accounts. So that also happened in 2014. The cooperation agreement also talks about international representation and is specifying that actually if you have like an international meeting, it's not just Belgium that goes, it also should be the case that one of the members of the regional authorities goes along to international meetings to ensure representation of regional authorities as well. And then it specifies working groups and a number of specific tasks, which I'll come back to in a minute. So in terms of the operations of the IIS, I mean, the first thing to say is that actually the name is a little bit misleading because it talks about an institute, but it actually doesn't have any significant staff or any structure. It's basically more of a coordination mechanism rather than an institute with a budget and with staff and so on. I mean, there is a budget and there is very little staff, but it's not like an institute that you would see in other contexts. So it's more like a coordination mechanism. So there is some staff, of course, to manage the secretariat of the IIS, and that's someone in Stadbel in the NSI that looks after the secretariat. To organize the meetings, and we have board meetings, so there's a board of the IIS with a chair and a vice chair. I'm the current chair of the IIS, and the vice chair is the current temporary head of Stadbel as head of the NSI. And it specifies that there are 6 members plus observators as well. And then it also has a number of working groups to actually make this coordination happen in practice. We have working groups on data protection, on international issues, international positioning of Belgium in the international statistical community. There's a working group on the work program, the coordination of the activities of the various players in the system. And then there's a working group on the SDGs, on the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the 4 working groups that we have. And then the cooperation agreement also specifies that there's 4 main objectives of the IIS. The first one is to publish, to coordinate, establish, and publish the annual statistical work programs of the statistical authorities. So there is quite a bit of coordination going on there to make sure that the national level statistical work program takes into account the work programs at the regional level. The IIS also needs to look at international positioning. For instance, if Eurostat is asking for a position from Belgium on a new statistical development in Europe, then we will make sure that the regions have their input there as well, and that we can go forward with a common point of view. The IIS can also recommend methodological improvements to official statistics producers in terms of, for instance, quality or coherence of statistics. And of course, like the Eurostat Code of Practice is a very important tool, a very important quality framework, not just for Stadbel, but also for the regional statistical authorities as well. So the IIS can look at quality monitoring in practice within the whole system as well. Okay, just to make it a bit more concrete, I'll just give you some examples of the work that comes out of those 4 working groups I've mentioned. On the work program, for instance, these are just a few examples. There's many more that you can find in the annual reports of the IIS on the website. But for instance, like there have been quite a few efforts to look at the harmonization, which is very important, as Paul also just outlined, in terms of education statistics, for instance. Education within Belgium is actually a policy competence that's completely devolved to the regions. So actually it's very important that between the regions and Stadbel and the international organizations like Eurostat, we have harmonized definitions and coordinated approach to these statistics. Another example is that Eurostat is looking at the development of a new survey around gender-based violence. And again, this is something where the IIS then said, okay, let's look at a joint approach here in terms of developing the questionnaire and setting up a system for funding as well between the 4 statistical authorities to make sure that we in Belgium can carry out this survey for Eurostat as well. In the working group on the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, we've been looking at the selection of indicators to measure progress within Belgium against the SDGs. But also we look at regional indicators, and the working group is currently looking at how can we develop some of the indicators of the SDG framework at the regional level to also give information at the regional level about progress against the SDGs. The data protection, data sharing working group is of course looking at things like sharing best practice in terms of how can we best share the data between the different statistical authorities in the system. What are the legal constraints? What are the legal frameworks that we need to take into account? And how can we then, for instance, develop common protocols so that we have a common approach in terms of sharing data, which is in line with legislation, but common in terms of the practice within the IIS partners. And then finally, the Working Group International, of course, is looking at, for instance, the ESSC, which is the kind of governing body for the European statistical system that's being led by Eurostat. So internationally, at each of the board meetings of the IIS, we look at the agendas of the ESSC, and we look at where the IIS should formulate a position, where Eurostat is asking for input from member states in the statistical work. The other big activity for the last year and a half or so within the IIS has been the development of the peer review. So the peer review is where Eurostat each year every 5 years actually goes to the member states and is doing an internal audit of the way in which member states comply with the code of practice. And so we've just had in the last year, we had the peer review team visiting Belgium. And of course, they looked at the overall system within Belgium. I think one of their first comments was that the Belgian system is probably the most complex they had come across within Eurostat. But they also recognized, I think, that actually, as Paul just said, lots of effort goes into the coordination. And I think we can get better at coordinating still, but I think the framework that we currently have, even though it is very complex, it does actually work. And it does actually give some results in terms of better coordination. So that's the thing that we really should acknowledge, I think. Now, after 6 years, it's maybe time to have a very very careful and also quite a personal maybe reflection on where have we had successes and where can we improve in the future with the IIS. And I think the first success is simply to acknowledge that we do have a much better understanding, I think, between the 4 partners in terms of what's happening within the regions and at the federal level when it comes to official statistics. And I think it's maybe quite an obvious point, but I think it's not to underestimate how important the information sharing is, just to keep each other abreast of what's happening within the different regions and at the federal level. So that's the first success, I think. I think we also have managed to create a better environment for data sharing, at least within the partners of the IIS. Still more work can be done there, I think, but I think at least we have a common understanding with common protocols, common legal frameworks to actually improve on the data sharing between the statistical authorities in Belgium. And the third success, I think it's what I said very much in the beginning. I think through this whole new setup, I think it has become quite obvious that the regional administrations, the regional governments within Belgium, they do have to look at a system of official statistics, and they have to play along, and they have to actually accept that there are certain responsibilities that come with having a system of official statistics when it comes to, for instance, funding, staffing, but also, for instance, in terms of professional independence of official statistics within a government context. I think it's important to acknowledge that the IIS has an important role, has played an important role here in terms of establishing the concept of official statistics within the regional context. But of course, we can still improve. We've only been running 6 years, and just like in Switzerland, as Paul just said, the coordination of such a complex system takes up lots of time and resources. And it means that we go to lots of meetings and have lots of sometimes difficult conversations with colleagues, but it does take up quite a bit of our time. And so I think in the future we will continue to work on that, but I think there's certain areas for improvements as well. I think one of the big challenges, I think, is the data that sit outside this bubble of the IIS. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there's lots of other data producers, both at the regional level, but also at the federal level, that do not sit within the bubble of the IIS. And so the data sharing with those institutions is quite often much more difficult and could be improved, I think, in the future. So we need to find some better mechanisms there to work on that. I think another possible improvement is that we maybe should look at more operational coordination. I think the board and the working groups look at very useful issues. But for instance, in terms of having joint website maybe, or having more visible expression of the coordination, could be a useful step forward for the IIS. Just to tell the world that actually we are coordinating, and we do things in a very similar way within Brussels, Wallonia, Flanders, and at the Belgian level. So I think this operational coordination can be improved as well, I think. And finally, I think as chair of the board at the moment, I think we probably should spend a bit more time on being slightly more proactive and strategic in terms of setting out the direction of the IIS. I think at the moment we are working in a good way. We are doing the work that needs to happen. But I think we could be slightly more proactive, for instance, in the developments around new data, for instance, in disseminating European statistics from within Belgium and so on. And I can't really reveal too much about the upcoming publication of the peer review for Belgium, but I think the peer review team also recognize that actually there's more scope and more room for improvement there in terms of the statistical system in Belgium. So that's my personal view. So it's not like an official view, it's my personal view that we could do better there. Okay, finally, we are at an international conference today, so I just wanted to link back to some of the stuff I've said in the beginning, some of the things that Paul also mentioned. Why this conference? Why do we want to look at regional statistics and maybe more specifically the institutional setup around regional statistics at this conference today? So I think the first point is around governance models. I think, of course, the governance of each statistical system within each country will be different because politically there are differences in the way that countries are federalized or interfederalized. So I think there will be differences there in which the statistical systems are set up. But I still think that we can learn from each other. And I think it's really useful to talk. I just, in the morning session or in the morning coffee, I had like a really useful chat already with the colleagues from Basque Country to find out about the way they coordinate things. In Scotland, in Catalonia, we heard about Switzerland. So there's like lots of countries who work with like a federal model. But we don't really talk much about the governance of the statistical system within those federal countries. And I think we can probably share some more information there to try to find best practice, to find ways of working which are the most efficient way in terms of dealing with those very different institutional setups. I think a second point is a question around the relationship with international bodies. I think in some cases, in terms of governance again, it is still mainly the country level, federal level, national level institute that has links with international bodies such as Eurostat or the OECD or the UN. Now, at the same time, those institutions are getting more and more interested in regional statistics. So one of the questions is, should we always go through the national level to actually liaise with international bodies? And maybe that's also a question for those international bodies, is what are the best ways of actually engaging with regional statistical institutes to actually get the best quality information for their purposes as well. So I think there's some interesting questions that we could discuss in terms of the governance and in terms of the stream of information between regional, national level and the international level. I think a third interesting point is the visibility of regional statistics. And I mean, clearly for instance, like a policy area like education, which doesn't have any national policy interest, but is completely devolved to the regions. Does it make sense to, for instance, in international publications to have Belgian indicators on education? It's an interesting question. Maybe there is a case for that, but maybe there's also a case to say, actually, it's better to keep it completely separate for the three regions in Belgium and to recognize it in the publication of international statistics as well. I think also it's interesting because, like, of course, within the world of statistics, we all work from a political independent perspective. We are professionally independent from politics. At the same time, I think it's recognized that politically there is a move in some countries to further federalization. In some regions, maybe even discussions about independence from the national level. How do we operate in that context from a statistics viewpoint? I mean, I think it's a very interesting question in terms of the tension between some political development, in terms of politicians wanting to have higher visibilities of their regions, also within statistics, versus the professional independence that we have to keep as statisticians. So there's some tensions there that I think we can usefully talk about as well. And then finally, international policy. Paul has just given a few good examples of how international organizations are, of course, having or doing lots of work around international policy development. How do we relate as regional institutions there? Should we look at, for instance, harmonization, which is like one of the points that Paul made very strongly. Harmonization, co-financing. What is our role there in relation to international policy? In relation to, for instance, again, education policy, where quite often the Ministry of Education has some links with the OECD, for instance, but we as a statistical authority are not always cited on those relationships, which is maybe fine, but maybe we should have a discussion about what benefits and the challenges are there. So just a few reflections on the reason why we do this conference today. I think there's quite a few issues that are sitting under the skin, but I think it could be useful
Sorry, less of a question, more of a statement. Just I would back what you said about regional statistics and working with international organisations. I think we've heard already this morning how regional statistics are becoming more important for these international organisations. And the one thing that was sitting in my head coming over from Scotland was I don't have enough contact with those organisations, so I would echo that as well. So thank you for making that point.
Okay, pleasure. There's a question here at the front as well.
Thank you, Roland. Actually, it's also more a comment or an anecdote, actually. A little while ago, there was a lot of discussion at the OECD following the release of PISA results, so educational outcomes, where a graph was presented that was a mixture of countries and provinces or regions and their PISA results. Included Belgium, but Belgium was not, or the regions were not the issue of debate. The issue of debate was that the 3 Chinese provinces for which the OECD had conducted PISA tests came out first in this whole list. And so there was a lot of discussion whether this is a legitimate comparability or whether you may or may not put this into one graph. And of course, you can imagine there's a lot of discussion also vis-a-vis China and so on. So what we tried to do then is to take a bit of a step back and develop some first principles about what to communicate and how to represent subnational data as it comes out of the OECD work. Now, one of the principles that we developed there was that it also partially depends on the policy question that is being posed. Okay, so in the case at hand, it is true that you may compare a particular province or a particular region with a country in the context of PISA if the educational system corresponds to the same type of unit. Okay, so in Belgium, it makes sense to compare Flanders and Austria, because that's where the educational policy happens. But that was just one of the principles that came through. I mean, there are other things that were developed, and it just made me think of this when you spoke, and I was actually wondering whether these little set of principles that we had developed and which we sent to our committee on statistics and statistical policy ever made it sort of to your desk, because it would have been interesting to have the regional statisticians have their say on these principles that are going forward.
Now, thanks for the comment, but I haven't had them on my desk, so I'll be interested in seeing them. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Roland. I have one question from the Basque Country. As you know, we in the Basque Country, our institute is completely oriented for the needs of the Basque government. I mean, INE is oriented for the needs of the Spanish government, but we work very closely linked with the regional policies. And my question is, in Belgium, how do you link the different actors in statistics with the different government levels? I mean, it's something I'm curious about, because sometimes I have to recognize that in the Basque Country, we duplicate the work done by INE, but we have a very developed regional government. So they had those needs and we have to give them those answers. But I was wondering what's the situation in Belgium. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, the answer there is that, like, actually in Belgium, we also have very strong regional governance. And for instance, like we have like our own parliament, we have our own government within Flanders, within Wallonia, within Brussels. Now, the first thing to say there is that that's what I said in the beginning, that each of those regions now has like legislation in place to cement the principles around official statistics within the regions. So that's the first way of actually saying we as a regional government, we also subscribe to those international principles, and actually implied, we also subscribe to international definitions. And I think that's something that's quite important in terms of the point that Paul made around harmonization, is that actually we are committed now within Flanders to put forward internationally harmonized concepts when it comes to measuring things statistically. So that's the first important point, I think. Once you have that, you can then actually also link quite easily to the federal level statistical office, because they would use the same definitions and the same harmonized principles. So in Belgium, we do this through this IIS, which is the coordination mechanism that I've just explained. So we have meetings, we have working groups to ensure that we keep talking, not just between the regions, but also from the regions to the federal national government level, National Statistical Institute. And so that's why we spent lots of time coordinating and meeting and having lots of discussions about the coordination. But yeah, I mean, I accept in some regions there will be a very strong need to have like the statistics sit very close to the policy at the regional level. But even in that case, I think you can still work along those lines which are being used by national statistical officers internationally to make sure that you align yourself with definitions and with standards. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I think we can go for lunch, right? But that's your thing to say.
Almost. Because before we go to lunch, I just want to give you some more information about the afternoon. So at 1:30, we have 2 parallel sessions. You can say on your name card which one you subscribed for, in case you forgot. Session 1, Regional Data Working Together, will take place in the neighboring building. So 10 minutes in advance, our colleagues from Statistics Flanders will guide you to the right room. And then the second session on regional data in an international context will take place here in this auditorium. And then, as I told you, at 3:30, there's our reception, which is also in this building. So now we are ready for lunch, Roeland. Here my part ends. I just want to invite you to lunch. also here in the atrium of this building. So I hope everyone had an interesting morning, and I wish you a very inspiring afternoon. Thank you.